Today, I'm building something that I'm completely honored to build. My wife last week got the unfortunate news that her father had passed away. And her father was a lifelong military man, and he even retired as a colonel in the U.S. Air Force. And he's survived by his wife, who asked me last week if I would have the time to build him an urn. And not only could I not say no, but I was completely honored by this request. So join me today as I have the unfortunate task of building my father-in-law's urn as well as my stepmother-in-law's urn for when she passes away. So this was obviously an emotional project, but I was very happy to do it. And just like with most burials and funerals, the timing was very quick and I only had a week to build these two urns. And this project allowed me to practice doing a few techniques like doing box joints and even doing some inlays with my shaper origin and filling them with epoxy. And luckily I got them done just in time, as these will be shipped out tomorrow. And even though you may not be building an urn anytime soon, there may be a few techniques in here that you could use on some future projects. So come along with me as I tackle this very important task of building these two urns. So I'm guessing most of you haven't made an urn before. In this case, these urns have some specific dimensions. They need to be 10.5 inches tall by 7.5 inches wide by 7.5 inches deep. And as far as the thickness of material, I'm going to try to shoot for about 1/2 inch thick, and this is perfect for 6/4 lumber. And I think I've got just enough hard maple to complete this job, so let's get started and mill up this lumber. So the biggest challenge with this project was the time frame, as I had about 5 to 6 days to complete this entire project. This meant that I had to work with the lumber that was on hand, as there was no time to go to the sawmill. But luckily I had just enough hard maple to get me through this entire project. And this project was really quite a change for me, as I'm used to building bigger things like furniture. If there's one thing I learned from this entire project, it's that smaller projects are not necessarily easier to do or take less time. So after rough cutting all my hard maple down to a workable size, it was now time to start thinking about the layout. And at this point in the build, I was thinking about grain direction and having it wrap around the entire urn. But what I came to realize is none of this organization is necessary, as I'm doing box joints on the corners of each one of these boxes. And as I was cutting this wood up, I did notice I did have a couple of pieces of this maple that had some beautiful flame figure. So with every last piece of hard maple I had left in my shop cut to rough length, I could now begin the smoothing process. And I'm not quite sure I like milling smaller pieces of wood up like this or the longer ones. It may have been a better idea to smooth out this lumber in the long format and then cut it down to size after it was milled up, as it took me a solid 3 to 4 hours to plane and joint all of these smaller pieces of wood. And my dust collector got a solid workout, as I filled up an entire 1.5 bags of sawdust with this process. But I do like the milling process, and it's really nice to see when everything comes out smooth and square. Now it's at this point in the build that I wasn't quite sure how thick I wanted this wood to be. I had a rough idea that I wanted this to be about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch thick. But I kinda just played it by ear, and I stopped the planing when the thickness felt right, which in this case was about 0.6 inches. And after all the planing and jointing was done, I just cleaned up the last edge over at the table saw to maximize the yield. With everything now milled up, I could then go over to one of my assembly tables and begin the process of matching the wood so that everything was continuous. Not only was I trying to match the grain, but I was also trying to incorporate the one board that had a lot of figure in it. With all the pieces matched up, it was now time to begin the glue up process. And this is the first time that I got to use that Rockler glue roller that I reviewed a couple of weeks ago in a project. And I'll tell you what, this thing's a heck of a lot easier than using a finger, and it even might save a couple shirts. And as you can see here, I glued up a lot of panels, more than I actually needed, but since I was under such a tight time crunch, I didn't want to have to go back later and glue up more. Now that I've got all those panels glued up, I'm going to let those sit overnight and come back tomorrow so that we can sand them down and begin to work on those box joints. Well, after day one, I came back the next day and took all those panels out of clamps. And to make this sanding process as painless as possible, I pulled out a tool that I don't use that often, the drum sander. This saved me a lot of time, got rid of all that glue squeeze out, and really allowed that figure to shine through on the wood. Now with all the building blocks made, I can begin to cut these things down to their final size, which is 10.5 inches tall, but since I'll be adding a lid to this, I cut them down to about 1/2 inch short. Once I had each board's height cut to size, I could then go back to the miter saw. And here I'm just cleaning up one edge of each one of the panels. It's this edge that will give me a clean reference point so that I can cut the width down to the exact dimensions that these urns need to be, which in this case is exactly 7.5 inches wide. And with a 7.5 inch marking made on a couple of the boards, I could then go back to the miter saw, set up a stop block, and then batch out the rest of the boards. And with that final cut made, it was now time to move over to the router table and attempt the next step, which was one I was most worried about, which is to cut out the box joints. Now luckily I do have a rockler jig for this, which did help out tremendously. The key to making this work is to have the jig completely calibrated. In this case I'm going with 1/2 inch box joints. And if you're interested in the setup of this jig and how to use this jig, I've done a whole video on it. And I even went back and rewatched that video just so that I could refresh myself on how to use this jig. But essentially, the first two sides using this jig are the easiest, and these sides are on the opposite side of the box. You essentially use the finger on the jig to cut out the fingers on both edges of the side of the box. Once you have both of those sides cut out, you then use them as a reference guide for the other two sides of the box, making sure that the tops on two adjacent sides are touching each other, referencing the key on the jig, and you just cut out the rest of the fingers. Once all four sides were cut out, I just did a dry fit to make sure that this box would come together and all those fingers would interlock. And these joints were a little tight, as you can see me using my hammer, but I'd rather have them tight than too loose. Once I was pleased with how the boxes fit together, I then wanted to create a couple labels on the box. I first wanted to label each top of the box with the label top. I also labeled the outside edge of each box with an O, and with all those labels made, I could begin to think about how I'm going to place a bottom inside this box. So I grabbed a 1/4 inch plywood bit, which is just a little bit undersized, and placed it into my router. Then I could run two panels that were on the opposite side of the box through the router at about a 1/4 inch away from the router bit. But that was the easy part. The hard part is doing the two sides with the pins. To do these two pieces, I made a couple of marks on my router table where I'll start the plunge cut and end it. With those markings made, I can begin the plunge cut on the pin and take it down all the way over to the other pin. And I'll have to say, I was really worried about those pins chipping out, but luckily both the pins stayed intact. It was just imperative that I made sure that my router came to a complete stop before removing each side. With all of those grooves made, I could then take my 1/4 inch maple plywood and cut it down to size. Then it was just a matter of doing a test fit to make sure everything would come together nicely. With those bottoms made, it was now time to start the inlay process. To do this, I wanted to find the exact center of each one of these boards. With that center marked out, I could then take my panel over to the shaper workstation. With the panel over at the workstation, I could then flip the panel over and add some double-sided tape. And I'll leave a link to this tape in the description below, as this is the best double-sided tape that I've encountered for woodworking. Once the panel was secure, I could then begin the scanning process with the shaper origin, and that's where that center marking is going to come into play. It's this marking that's going to allow me to place my SVG file directly on the center of each panel. And to route out this material, I'm using an 1/8 inch spiral upcut bit, which requires a smaller collet. And you can see by using this smaller bit how little material is removed from each one of these pockets. So this was a fairly time-consuming process, but frankly you can't argue with the results. To do the lettering, however, I had to use an even smaller bit. In this case, I used an engraving bit. And cutting out a pocket for each one of these letters took a heck of a lot of time, but once again you can't argue with the results. And with all of those engravings made and the panel removed from the workstation, we can finally get an idea of what this thing is going to look like. But we need to fill this thing with epoxy, so the first thing that we need to do is to add a seal coat into those inlays. Now the reason I'm doing this is because we're going to be adding some darker colors with that epoxy. And if I don't do this, there's a chance that the end grain on those inlays will suck up some of that darker colored epoxy and stain the wood. I'm also going to take my hot glue gun and create a couple of dams so that the two colors with this inlay won't run together. And for this pour, I'm going to be using some liquid glass epoxy, which I've had some success with in the past. By adding parts A and B together, I just give it a mix for about 5 minutes. And to add some color to this epoxy, I'll just be using some resin dye. So I'll first divide out the epoxy into two containers, one for blue and one for black. Then I can just add some dye and just mix it together until I get the right color I'm looking for. And unfortunately, this dye just wasn't doing the trick, so I had to add some mica powder just so that you couldn't see through the epoxy. But after adding the mica powder and the dye, I finally got the look I was going for, so I could begin the pouring process. And once I got that blue in, I could add the second batch of black to the writing. And after a quick pass with the torch, I could get rid of those bubbles and let the epoxy cure, which took about 72 hours, but when I came back, I was pretty pleased with the results. So it was just a matter of sanding everything down flush to the wood. And for future reference, I probably should have removed that hot glue with a chisel first, as the heat from that sanding just reactivated that glue and made it so it stuck to everything on the panel. But after scraping it off with my finger, I was able to get back to sanding and get that epoxy down to the wood level. And I'm so glad I put that sealer down, as all the lines were very crisp. And by taking a rag and adding a little bit of water, you can see what the final product will look like. Now that I've got all that epoxy removed, it's now time to sand the entire piece. And for the sanding process, I want to collect a little bit of the maple sawdust in case I have some cracks in those finger joints. So with my dust bag attached to my sander, I go ahead and sand the inside and outside of each one of these sides of the urns. And with everything sanded, I can now finally begin the glue up process. So with my entire box laid out, the first thing that I'm going to glue up is the bottom, as all the sides will need to fit around this bottom. With the bottom in place and glued up, I can then begin the process of gluing on the third side. And for this process, I don't need a heck of a lot of glue, as this joint is very strong even without glue. But I do make sure I get glue in between each crevice, in between each one of those fingers. Then it's just a matter of tapping the third side into place. And after that, I can repeat this entire process on the fourth and final side. And with just a few taps, everything comes together and squares up perfectly. And if there are a few gaps in those joints, it's nothing that a couple of clamps can't fix. And the more clamps, the better. It's just going to remove all those gaps so that you have less to deal with once you get to final sanding. And as to be expected, with the clamps engaged, this thing is perfectly square. And bonus points to anybody who can guess how many clamps are on this box. With that glue curing up, I can now turn my attention to the lid. And for the lid, it's really going to be a simple process. I first need to cut it down to the right dimensions of 7.5 by 7.5. And with my lid cut to size, I just want to add a round over to one side. So I'll just chuck my bit up into my router and lower it down until it's flush with the table. Then I can take my lid and do the end grain on both sides of the lid and then do the edge grain. This will just ensure that if I get any tear out with that end grain, I can just remove it once I do the sides. With that round over made, you can see how nicely this will fit. But I need a lip on this thing so that it will rest on top of that urn. So I'll just take a flat piece of stock and make sure that it's the right size for this lid. Then I can take this stock, add a little bit of wood glue, and place it on the bottom side of this lid and place some weight until that glue cures. And with that lid now curing up, it's time to go back to those urns. After removing all the clamps, you can see that some of those fingers are just a little bit proud, and that's exactly what I want. These are easily sanded flush with just a little bit of elbow grease. But as you can see, after sanding those fingers flush, these joints aren't perfect, as there's a couple of gaps in between those fingers that we need to fill. And this is where that sawdust that we collected earlier will come into play. After dumping out some of that sawdust and adding a little bit of wood glue, we have some filler that perfectly matches that wood. And after mixing it up, I can apply this filler to all those cracks that we saw earlier. Then it's just a matter of taking our sander with no dust collection and sanding everything down. And after addressing each one of those cracks, you can see that after a little bit of filler and some sanding, all those joints come together perfectly. With all of my small errors cleaned up, I could then blow it off to get it ready for finishing. And for this process, I'm going to keep it very simple with just some Danish oil. And it's amazing how this Danish oil really brings out the character of that wood and the beauty of the inlays. Not to mention the beauty of those finger joints with the contrast of the end grain and the edge grain. And surprisingly, this hard maple really soaked it up, and I ended up putting on 4 coats of this Danish oil. But I think the results speak for themselves. Well, I really appreciate you joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment, and share this video. And to wrap up today's video, I'm going to leave you with a few pictures in remembrance of my father-in-law.